The radio kept making that sound long after the batteries were dead.
It wasn't static, but a slow, patient breath coming through the speaker.
3 of us stood under the tower stairs, listening to it breathe.
The snow had buried most of the tracks, but a few prints remained.
They stopped in a clean circle beneath the old ponderosa pines.
The second set of tracks looked just like his, with the same worn heel.
I need you to understand something before I go any further.
Say in a natural American voice, bitter and tired. Men like me don't tell stories like this because we enjoy being believed.
We tell them because silence starts to feel like helping something hide.
This happened in February of 2003, in a part of Idaho where maps lose their confidence.
The Selway-Bitterroot Wilderness sits hard against the Montana line.
It is not the kind of wilderness that welcomes a man.
Warren Keene was a retired schoolteacher who volunteered for a survey. He was 71, but a wiry mountain man carved out of rootwood.
He claimed he could find a lookout in a whiteout by smell alone.
At 2:03, dispatch received one broken transmission.
It was Warren's voice, but he sounded embarrassed and almost annoyed.
He said, "I can see myself below the tower," and then the line went dead.
By the time my partner Lyle and I reached the gate, the weather had turned mean. Heavy snow was falling straight down, no wind yet, which is worse. You could shout into it and feel your own voice die 10 feet away.
We rode in on 2 machines, with headlamps cutting tunnels through the snow.
We found Warren's snowmobile half a mile below the lookout trail.
It was parked cleanly, with no sign of a crash or broken branches.
His thermos sat upright in the rear basket, still warm enough to steam.
That bothered me more than it should have. A man like Warren did not walk away from hot coffee in February. The trail was too steep for machines, so we went on snowshoes.
The world narrowed to the glow of our lamps and the rasp of our breathing.
Once, 10 minutes into the climb, I heard something off to our left.
Lyle stopped dead in his tracks.
The knocking came again, echoing from the ridge.
We just stood there, listening to the sound die away.
Lyle didn't answer me.
He tried to call dispatch, but the radio stayed silent.
We were completely alone out here. The lookout door was wide open.
Warren would never have left it like that.
The room smelled like cold ashes and something else.
Snow had blown inside and covered the floor.
His gear was just sitting there, left behind.
Dread and disbelief. There were 4 photos on the camera, and they were all wrong.
The last photo showed Warren standing below the tower.
He was shielding his eyes from the light.
But there were no tracks leading to him in the snow. We found the radio under the stairs.
The battery was gone, but it was still making noise.
It sounded like it was breathing. The radio started whispering.
Then it said Lyle's name.
It wasn't coming from the radio anymore. It was a woman's voice.
Lyle looked like he was being called home. I grabbed his sleeve to snap him out of it. Something was moving between the trees. I couldn't see a body, just motion.
Then I heard my mother's voice.
She said, "You left the porch light on."
It was something she used to say to me.
Lyle slapped me to bring me back.
We stood there in the freezing dark, the radio at our feet still breathing.
Every instinct I had was screaming at me to turn around and run.
But Warren was still out there, and we had to keep going. We followed the tracks into the timber.
There were 2 sets, meeting at the base of the tower.
He had simply walked away, beside himself. The snow deepened under the timber.
Our headlamps caught flakes close to our faces.
The tracks made deliberate looping shapes around clusters of trees.
Lyle noticed it first, crouching beside one of the prints. The 2 Warren tracks were no longer identical.
The second set was learning. We found Warren's orange cap hanging from a low branch.
It had been tied there with a strip of survey tape. Below it, someone had written in the snow, "Not him yet." We called dispatch again, but there was nothing.
Just a clicking on the channel. 3 clicks, then 2, then 3.
It was the same pattern we had heard in the trees.
The storm began to clear.
It stopped, like someone had shut a door.
The ridge appeared, pale under a clouded moon. Somewhere ahead, Warren Keene began to sing.
It was an old trail song I knew.
The singing ahead of us had an unsettling flatness.
Lyle looked at me and shook his head.
I was young enough to think duty could protect me. I stepped forward and the voice moved away.
We followed it down the draw. The tracks were still there, but now there were more of them.
It was like someone was practicing Warren's footsteps.
Then my lamp hit something nailed to a tree.
It was Warren's 4th photograph, somehow printed and fixed to the bark. In the photo, a second figure stood behind him, with its face scratched away.
Lyle leaned in, his breath fogging in the bean. He told me he had seen this before. He spoke of a smoke jumper from '84 who walked off the line after hearing a voice.
The singing stopped, and a small amber light appeared ahead.
It looked like a lantern, but Warren had packed no light. The figure bobbed unevenly through the trees, hunched against the cold. I called out Warren's name, and the figure stopped. It slowly raised one hand to shield its eyes.
Then the radio on Lyle's chest crackled to life with Warren's voice.
The figure spoke with my own voice.
It begged me not to make it come back alone.
Hearing my own voice outside my body was terrifying. Lyle fired a flare into the trees. The red light revealed the figure wasn't Warren at all.
It was something wearing his outline poorly, with a darkness where a face should be.
We found Warren at the edge of a chute, alive but gray with cold. He clutched his camera to his chest.
He grabbed my sleeve with a hand that felt like sticks wrapped in wet paper.
We half-carried Warren back toward the lookout. He kept trying to turn his head to look behind us. He whispered that the thing below the tower had looked exactly like him.
We were 50 yards from the lookout when Warren stopped.
From the tower above, a voice called down. Lyle's dead wife stood in the open doorway, her hair moving gently. Lyle took a step toward the stairs.
The woman's smile slipped, settling wrong like a mask. Then Warren stood above Warren, looking down at himself.
Every radio we carried erupted at once. Stunned and confused, voices from the past and present filled the air. The sound was so loud, the radio casing cracked. Lyle fired the flare toward the lambing. The staircase flooded in a violent crimson light.
The copy turned its head and looked right at me.
The tower stairs groaned as Warren fell.
We caught him and dragged him down into the snow.
The copy just watched us from the landing. The copy spoke in my mother's voice. We ran after that.
There's no noble way to say it. We just ran.
We dragged Warren through the dark timber. Voices moved alongside us in the dark. They were calling our names from everywhere. Warren collapsed at the snowmobiles. Lyle tied him in with emergency straps.
He told me to ride first and not to stop.
The ride down was a tunnel of trees. I heard Lyle shouting my name from the woods. I saw a figure in the road and drove straight through it. Warren lived 3 more days.
He asked for a pencil on his last night.
He wrote 4 words on a menu. The lookout was removed in 2011.
Men watched it burn and joked about ghosts.
They never found the lower landing. I went back to the ridge years later. I stood where the stairs had been. A voice behind me said my name. I turned around to face the clearing. A man stood between the pines, wearing my old service jacket.
His face was hidden by his hat, and he was shielding his eyes.
At his feet, I saw 2 sets of tracks.
One set led out of the trees, and the other led back in.
They were both mine. I stood there, frozen in place. The wind started to howl through the trees.
The air around him hummed with that same static sound.
He lowered his hand, and I finally saw his face. It looked like a mask left out in the rain. His eyes were hollow and held no light. I reached for my radio, but it was Gat. The silence of the mountain felt really heavy. I realized I was being invited into the same loop. He took a step toward me. The sound of his boots was too loud and deliberate. I backed away, slipping on the frozen ground. I turned and ran into the thick timber. The trees seemed to close in around me. Every shadow looked like a person I knew. I stumbled and fell into the snow. When I looked up, the forest was gone. I was in a room filled with the sound of the dead. I scrambled to my feet and kept running. My lungs were burning from the freezing air. I heard my own voice calling from the darkness. I finally reached the edge of the ridge. The moonlight hit the snow, and I reached the road. I escaped, but I knew the mountain would be waiting. I finally made it to the road. The silence out here is just wrong. My hands are shaking so bad I can't even hold my keys. I knelt down to grab my keys. That's when I saw them again. The tracks were everywhere, circling my truck like they were waiting for me. I got inside and locked the doors. The engine was struggling to start in this cold. I heard a soft knocking on the back window, but I didn't dare look. Finally, the engine caught. I drove as fast as I could, but the road felt endless. Every shadow in the headlights looked like someone standing there. I didn't stop until I hit the highway. The streetlights felt like a sanctuary. I kept checking the mirror, just waiting for something to be there. I got home, but the silence was just as bad. I sat in the dark for hours, trying to make sense of it. I kept hearing my own voice in my head. I started writing everything down. I thought it would help, but it just made it worse. The words on the page don't even look like mine anymore. I stopped going outside altogether. The sound of the wind just sets me off now. I'm always waiting for it to come back for me. Then I heard it. 3 knocks, then 2, then 3. I knew exactly who was standing on the other side of that door. I didn't open the door. I just stood there, listening to the silence. It's not just a place anymore. It's part of me. I finally turned the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The hallway was empty, just that flickering light buzzing overhead. There was nothing there, but the feeling of being watched was suffocating. I stepped out into the hall, moving as quietly as I could. At the far end, I saw a single wet boot print on the floor. It was fresh, and it was exactly like the ones from the mountain. I followed the prints toward the stairwell, my heart hammering in my chest. Each step felt heavier, like the building was trying to pull me down. I reached the landing and looked down into the dark, spiraling abyss. From the darkness below, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. It was the sound of someone breathing, slow and deliberate, echoing up the shaft. It was the same sound I had heard from the radio on the mountain. I backed away from the stairs and turned to run back toward my apartment. The hallway seemed to stretch out, the doors blurring into an endless tunnel. I could hear footsteps behind me now, matching my own pace, step for step. I reached my door and fumbled with the keys, my fingers slipping on the metal. The footsteps stopped just behind me. I shoved the key into the lock and twisted it, praying the door would open. The door clicked open, and I threw myself inside, slamming it shut. I locked every bolt and chain, leaning my back against the wood. Outside, there was silence. Then a soft, familiar voice spoke my name. It was my own voice, but it sounded tired, calm, and older. It said, "You shouldn't have told them." The sound of it vibrated through the wood of the door, right into my spine. I looked down at the floor, and my heart stopped. A shadow was stretching into the room, but it wasn't a normal shadow. It was a man in a parka, standing still, shielding his eyes from a light I couldn't see. I realized then that the door didn't matter.
The mountain hadn't followed me. It had been waiting for me to come home.
I sat on the floor, closed my eyes, and listened as the knocking began again, from inside the wall.
The knocking inside the wall wasn't just sound. It was a physical vibration that rattled the floorboards beneath me. I watched in horror as the plaster began to crack.
Dust drifted down like snow, coating my hands.
I scrambled backward as the wall gave way.
A cold mountain wind rushed into the room.
The apartment was gone, replaced by the dark, towering pines of the ridge.
I stood up and looked around at the familiar, desolate landscape. The lookout tower loomed above me, its wooden frame groaning under the weight of the snow.
I was back at the ridge, exactly where the nightmare had started.
The radio on my chest suddenly crackled to life. It wasn't dispatch. It was the sound of my own voice.
Say in a natural American voice. Every word was perfectly clear, echoing through the empty, frozen air.
I reached for the radio, but my hand stopped midair.
Standing at the base of the tower was a figure.
It was wearing my old green service jacket and holding a lantern.
It didn't move. It just stood there, waiting.
I took a step forward, the snow crunching loudly under my boots.
The figure raised its hand, shielding its eyes from the moonlight.
I felt a strange, cold pull in my chest.
The figure spoke, and it was my voice.
It sounded like it was coming from a great distance.
It said, "You shouldn't have told them." And then it began to walk toward me.
Its movements were jerky, unnatural.
I turned to run, but the snow had turned into a thick, viscous mud.
I looked down and saw that the tracks I was making were being filled by the tracks of the figure behind me. It was learning, it was catching up, and it was becoming me.
I fell to my knees and looked up at the tower one last time.
The figure was standing right in front of me now.
It reached out a hand, and for a second I saw my own face staring back at me.
The last thing I heard was the sound of the radio, breathing in and out.
I wasn't afraid anymore. I was just tired.
The mountain had finally taken what it wanted, and I was just another part of the silence.
I woke up on the cold floor of the lookout.
The air smelled like ozone and wet wool.
The radio was silent, but the silence felt heavy.
I stood up, my joints aching from the cold.
Outside, the storm had stopped, leaving the ridge in a terrifying, unnatural stillness. I walked to the door, but there was only a wall of white.
I stepped out onto the landing, the metal groaning under my boots.
Below me, the tracks were gone, replaced by a smooth, unbroken sheet of snow.
It was as if we had never been there.
Then I heard it. A faint, rhythmic knocking coming from the trees.
It was the same pattern we had heard before. 3 knocks, then 2, then 3.
I didn't run this time.
I walked toward the trees, my heart hammering against my ribs.
I knew what was waiting for me, and I knew that I couldn't hide from it anymore.
As I reached the edge of the clearing, the figure stepped out from behind a ponderosa pine.
It was wearing my old green service jacket, and its face was hidden by the shadow of its hat.
It didn't move. It just stood there, waiting.
I looked at the ground, and there were 2 sets of tracks in the dirt. One leading out of the trees, and one leading back in. Both of them were mine.
I realized then that I had been here before, and I would be here again.
The figure raised its hand, shielding its eyes from the moonlight.
It spoke, and it was my own voice, older and tired.
"You shouldn't have told them," it said, and then it turned and walked back into the trees.
I stood there for a long time, watching the trees.
The silence returned, but it wasn't empty anymore. It was full of voices, full of memories, and full of the things that the mountain had kept for itself. I turned and walked away, leaving the lookout behind.
I didn't look back, and I didn't listen for the knocking.
I just kept walking until the trees thinned and the world began to look like it belonged to me again.